The night it began, Madison Lane had no reason to suspect anything unusual. She was just another customer, placing an order on Temu, the app that promised everything at unbelievable prices. Like most people, she had scrolled through the endless deals, filling her cart with things she didn't really need. Cheap phone cases, quirky home decor, and a peculiar wooden box she had bought on impulse. It wasn't the kind of item she typically ordered, but something about it had caught her eye. It was old, ornate, and vaguely mysterious, listed as an antique keepsake chest. The description was vague, and the single photo wasn't much better, but the price was irresistible. She clicked buy now and moved on with her evening, never imagining that this one seemingly harmless purchase would change everything. 3 days later, the box arrived. Madison had nearly forgotten about it, her impulsive order buried under the weight of her busy life. But when she found the package sitting on her doorstep, her excitement flared. The box was smaller than she had expected, wrapped in plain brown paper with no markings other than her name and address. The delivery driver was long gone, but for some reason, Madison felt a strange unease as she carried the package inside. Her small apartment felt colder than usual that evening. She chalked it up to the weather, shrugging off the chill as she tore open the package. Inside was the wooden box, just as she had seen in the photo, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed almost too perfect for something listed as an antique. The wood was darker than she had imagined, almost black, and the carvings weren't just decorative. They formed symbols she didn't recognize, sharp and angular, running along every edge and corner of the box. Madison frowned, her fingers tracing the patterns. There was something oddly deliberate about them, as if they were trying to tell a story she couldn't understand. The box was heavy for its size, and when she opened it, she found it empty. No velvet lining, no compartments, just smooth, dark wood that smelled faintly of earth and something metallic. She tilted it toward the light, noticing faint scratches on the inside, as if something had been stored there and taken out in a hurry. Madison set it down on her coffee table, puzzled but intrigued. It was just a box. Harmless, she told herself. But that didn't explain why her unease was growing. She decided to place it on a shelf in her living room, where it could add a touch of character to the space. But as she stood back to admire it, she thought she heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, so soft it was almost imperceptible. She turned toward the box, her heart skipping a beat. The sound stopped. She shook her head, laughing nervously. "It's just my imagination," she said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. But the feeling didn't leave her. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the sense that something was watching her. Madison awoke to the sound of tapping. It was faint, deliberate, and rhythmic, cutting through the stillness of her apartment like a distant metronome. Her eyes fluttered open, the soft glow of the streetlight outside casting long shadows across her bedroom walls. For a moment, she lay frozen, her heart pounding as she tried to locate the source of the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room. The air in the apartment felt colder than it should have, and a deep unease settled in her chest as she sat up, the tapping growing louder. She told herself it was nothing, maybe a branch against the window, or the pipes groaning in the walls. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that. There was something too deliberate about the sound, too precise, as if it were meant for her alone. Grabbing her phone for light, she padded cautiously into the living room, the tapping stopping the moment she entered. The apartment was silent again, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing against her ears. The wooden box sat on the shelf, exactly where she had left it, its carvings catching the faint glow of her phone's flashlight. It looked unchanged, but Madison couldn't shake the feeling that it was different somehow. Closer. She approached the box, her fingers hesitating over the lid. It was just an object, she reminded herself. A thing. It couldn't hurt her. But when she touched it, a jolt ran through her hand, sharp and cold, as if the box itself were alive. She yanked her hand back, her breath catching. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, trying to laugh off the moment. But the laughter died in her throat when she noticed the scratches inside the box had changed. They were deeper now, more pronounced, forming shapes that hadn't been there before. They looked almost like letters, though she couldn't recognize the language. Madison closed the lid quickly, shoving the box back onto the shelf. She didn't want to look at it anymore. She didn't want to think about it. But as she turned away, she thought she heard a whisper, soft and low, just on the edge of perception. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and silence. She shook her head, muttering, "I'm losing it." The next day, Madison tried to go about her routine as if nothing had happened. She went to work, ran errands, and ignored the growing unease that gnawed at the edges of her mind. But when she returned home that evening, the atmosphere in the apartment felt heavier. The air was colder, the shadows longer, and the wooden box seemed to dominate the room, its presence impossible to ignore. She found herself avoiding it, her eyes darting away whenever she caught it in her peripheral vision. But no matter how much she tried to pretend it wasn't there, she couldn't escape the feeling that it was watching her. That night, the tapping returned, louder than before. Madison lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her hands clutching the blankets as the sound echoed through the apartment. Tap, tap, tap. It was no longer faint. It was deliberate, insistent, as if demanding her attention. She sat up, her heart pounding, and turned on her bedside lamp. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, and filled with an unspoken threat. Unable to bear it any longer, she marched into the living room, flipping on the lights and grabbing the box from the shelf. "What is your problem?" she snapped, her voice trembling. She opened the lid, half expecting something to leap out at her, but the box was empty. The scratches on the inside had grown deeper, the symbols more pronounced, almost glowing in the dim light. And then, without warning, the lid slammed shut, nearly catching her fingers. Madison yelped, dropping the box to the floor. It landed with a dull thud, its carvings seeming to writhe in the faint glow of the overhead light. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She wanted to throw it out, to get rid of it, but a part of her was terrified of what might happen if she did. The box felt alive now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't let her go. She left it where it had fallen, retreating to her bedroom and locking the door behind her. But as she lay in bed, trying to calm her racing heart, the tapping began again. Louder, closer, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Madison didn't sleep that night. The tapping and whispers grew louder, filling every corner of her small apartment. She lay curled up in her bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her heart racing with every sound. She tried to drown it out, covering her ears, humming to herself, anything to block out the noise. But it was no use. The sound wasn't coming from outside her. It was in her head, vibrating through her bones, resonating in the air around her. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, heavy, and unnatural. Madison sat up, her breath shaky as she glanced at the clock. It was 3:13 a.m. The room was still and dark, her bedside lamp casting faint, flickering light across the walls. She wanted to believe it was over, that whatever this was had passed. But deep down, she knew better. A sudden, sharp knock on her bedroom door made her jump, her blood running cold. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping she'd heard before. This was deliberate, demanding. She stared at the door, her mind racing. She was alone in the apartment. Or at least, she should have been. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. Madison scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone and flipping on the flashlight. She approached the door cautiously, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her breath caught in her throat as she gripped it, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing an empty hallway. The living room beyond was shrouded in shadow, the faint glow of a street lamp outside barely illuminating the space. The box was still on the floor where she had dropped it, its carved symbols casting eerie reflections on the walls. But the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She stepped into the hallway, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She moved toward the box, her heart pounding. It looked the same as before, small, dark, and unassuming. But as she reached out to touch it, the whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. The language was still foreign, but the tone was clear. A warning, a threat, or perhaps both. The lid of the box creaked open on its own, revealing the empty interior. Madison's breath hitched as the scratches inside the box began to shift, moving as if alive. The symbols rearranged themselves, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices filling the room. She stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, low, guttural voice that seemed to come from the box itself. "You!" Madison screamed, dropping the flashlight as the box tipped over, spilling darkness into the room like ink. It wasn't just shadows, it was something alive, something cold and malevolent that filled the space around her. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall as the darkness spread, swallowing the light. And then she saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and distorted. Its face was obscured, a featureless void that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. The figure moved toward her, its footsteps silent, its presence overwhelming. Madison tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. The air around her grew colder, the darkness pressing against her like a physical weight. The figure stopped just inches from her, its void-like face tilting as if studying her. And then, in that same low, guttural voice, it spoke again. "You opened the door." Tears streamed down Madison's face as she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The figure didn't respond. It raised one long, skeletal hand, pointing toward the box, which now sat upright on the floor. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the figure's movements. And then, as Madison watched in horror, the darkness began to retreat, flowing back into the box as quickly as it had spilled out. The figure dissolved with it, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a breeze. When the last of the darkness disappeared, the box slammed shut, the sound echoing through the silent apartment. Madison sat there for what felt like hours, her body trembling, her mind racing. The room was still and quiet, but the air was thick with the memory of what had just happened. She didn't know what the figure was, or why it had come for her. But one thing was clear: the box wasn't just an object. It was a doorway, a connection to something far beyond her understanding. And now that it was open, she wasn't sure she could ever close it again. Madison didn't sleep after the figure dissolved into the box. She sat in the corner of her living room, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the carved object that now felt like a living thing. The apartment was eerily silent, but the memory of the voice lingered, its guttural tones echoing in her mind. "You opened the door." The words carried weight, a sense of finality that made her stomach churn. She wanted to get rid of it, to throw the box as far from her as possible. But every time she tried to move, her body froze, her gaze locked on the intricate carvings that pulsed faintly, as if they were alive. She whispered to herself, a desperate mantra to regain her composure. "It's just a box. It's just a stupid box." But she knew better. It wasn't just a box. It was a doorway, a tether to something far beyond her understanding, something she had unintentionally unleashed. The sun rose slowly, its weak light filtering through the blinds, but the warmth it usually brought was absent. The apartment felt cold, the air dense with a tension that refused to lift. Madison finally forced herself to move, stumbling to her feet with shaky legs. She avoided the box, giving it a wide berth as she grabbed her phone and searched for someone, anyone, who could help her understand what she had brought into her home. Her search led her to obscure forums and websites, pages filled with warnings about cursed objects, haunted relics, and ancient symbols. Most of it felt like nonsense, but one thread caught her attention. A story about a similar box, described as an artifact of binding. The poster claimed the box was never meant to be opened, that it served as a prison for something that shouldn't exist in this world. The carvings are warnings, the post read. Not decoration. Once opened, it cannot be closed. The door remains ajar. Madison's breath quickened as she scrolled through the thread. The details were vague, but the warnings were clear. Destroying the box wouldn't solve the problem. It would only release whatever was bound to it. Her chest tightened as the realization sank in. She couldn't just get rid of it. She was trapped with it, bound to it, just as it was bound to her. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and bending in ways that didn't match the light. The tapping returned, soft and faint, coming from every corner of the room. It wasn't confined to the box anymore. It followed her, growing louder when she tried to ignore it. The strange occurrences began to escalate. Lights flickered, their bulbs buzzing faintly before plunging the apartment into brief darkness. The air grew colder, and no amount of heat could chase away the chill. Objects shifted when she wasn't looking. Her keys, her coffee mug, even her phone. All moved to new places as if guided by unseen hands. She tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that her fear was playing tricks on her. But when she found the box on her bedside table that evening, even though she had left it in the living room, she knew it wasn't just her mind. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, staring at the box. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, the apartment was still. And then the voice returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the walls. "You." Madison's blood ran cold. She grabbed the box and ran to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she set it on the counter. She searched the drawers frantically, pulling out a hammer. If she couldn't destroy the box, maybe she could at least damage it, stop whatever power it held. She raised the hammer, her grip tight, and brought it down with all her strength. The blow landed with a deafening crack, but when she lifted the hammer, the box was untouched. Not a single scratch marred its surface. The voice laughed. It wasn't the guttural tone from before. This was different, higher, almost childlike, but layered with something dark and menacing. The sound filled the room, pressing against her ears until she dropped the hammer, clutching her head. "You cannot break what binds you," the voice said, its tone almost mocking. "You opened the door. You are ours." Madison stumbled back, her legs shaking as the laughter faded, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire apartment. The shadows in the room deepened, pooling together like liquid, forming shapes that moved with deliberate intent. They weren't just shadows anymore. They had mass, form, and purpose. One by one, they began to rise, their shapes twisting into tall, distorted figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. She backed into the corner, her breath coming in short gasps as the figures turned toward her, their heads tilting in unison. The tapping resumed, louder now, echoing through the apartment like a drumbeat. The figures moved closer, their steps silent but deliberate, their presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. Madison pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Why me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The tallest figure stopped inches from her, its featureless face tilting downward. "You opened the door," it said, the voice resonating with a finality that left no room for argument. The shadows around it writhed, their movements erratic and unnatural, as if they were straining against invisible chains. Madison's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. The figures loomed over her, their presence suffocating, their forms flickering like distorted images in a broken projector. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they dissolved, retreating into the box. The lid slammed shut, and the room fell silent. Madison didn't move for what felt like hours. Her breathing was shallow, her mind reeling as she stared at the box on the counter. The apartment was silent now, but the air remained heavy, thick with a presence she couldn't escape. Her eyes darted to the hammer lying on the floor, useless against whatever malevolent force had taken hold of her home. She whispered to herself, over and over, "This can't be happening. But it was happening, and the realization left her trembling. By morning, she knew she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The thought of spending another moment in the same space as the box filled her with dread. She shoved it into a backpack, her hands trembling, and left without looking back. Outside, the world felt colder, grayer, as though the box's influence extended beyond the walls of her apartment. She didn't have a plan. All she knew was that she had to get rid of it. Somehow, someway. Her first stop was a local church. Madison had never been particularly religious, but desperation drove her to seek out any form of protection she could find. The building was quiet when she entered, the faint smell of incense lingering in the air. She approached the altar, her heart pounding as she set the backpack down and pulled out the box. It looked even darker in the soft light, its carvings seeming to writhe like living things. A priest emerged from a side door, his face kind but cautious as he approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his eyes falling to the box. Madison struggled to explain, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She told him about the whispers, the shadows, the figure that had emerged from the box. She begged him to take it, to destroy it, to do anything that would sever its connection to her. The priest listened quietly, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he shook his head. "I've heard of objects like this," he said, his voice low. "They're not meant to be owned, not meant to be touched. They're vessels, bridges to places we were never meant to reach." Madison's stomach sank. "Can you get rid of it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The priest hesitated, then said, "I can try. But understand, whatever is bound to this box may not leave you so easily." He took the box, carrying it to the altar. Madison watched as he opened a large book, its pages filled with faded text in a language she didn't recognize. He began to chant, his voice steady but strained, the words reverberating through the quiet church. The air grew colder, the light dimming as shadows crept along the walls. Madison clutched the back of a pew, her breath catching as the box began to tremble, its carvings glowing faintly. The priest's chanting grew louder, more urgent, as the shadows converged around him. And then, with a deafening crack, the box slammed shut, throwing the priest backward. Madison rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he looked at her. "It didn't work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever this is, it's tied to you now. You can't give it away. You can't escape it." Tears welled in Madison's eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She took the box, her hands trembling, and left the church without another word. The shadows followed her as she stepped outside, the air thick with their presence. She knew now that there was no one who could help her. She was alone, bound to the box and whatever lurked within it. With nowhere else to turn, Madison decided to leave town. She packed a bag, threw the box into the trunk of her car, and drove without a destination, hoping that distance might weaken the connection. The road stretched endlessly before her, the landscape blurring as her mind raced. But the further she drove, the heavier the air became. The tapping returned, faint at first, then louder, resonating through the car. The whispers followed, overlapping and incomprehensible, filling her mind with their chaotic cadence. The box, though hidden in the trunk, seemed to dominate the space, its presence pressing against her like a weight she couldn't escape. The radio flickered on and off, static filling the cabin, punctuated by faint, guttural laughs. Madison gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she tried to focus on the road. But no matter how far she went, the landscape didn't change. The trees lining the highway blurred together, their twisted branches leaning toward the car as if reaching for her. And then, the road ended. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from a dense wall of trees that hadn't been there moments before. Her heart pounded as she stared at the forest, its shadows deep and impenetrable. The tapping grew louder, the whispers more insistent, until they seemed to scream in her ears. She turned to look in the backseat, her breath catching as she saw the figure once more. It sat motionless, its featureless face turned toward her, its elongated limbs filling the small space. "You cannot run," it said, its voice reverberating through the car. "You cannot hide," Madison screamed, throwing open the door and stumbling out into the cold night. The air was thick with fog, the world around her muted and surreal. She ran, her footsteps echoing on the asphalt, but the tapping followed, faster now, keeping pace with her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that made her head throb. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, as the figure loomed over her, its shadow stretching impossibly far. "You opened the door," it said, its voice like a final judgment. "Now you must step through." Madison's knees pressed against the cold asphalt as the figure loomed over her, its shadow stretching across the road and dissolving into the fog. The whispers, louder than ever, were no longer unintelligible. They spoke to her directly, their words overlapping but clear. "Step through. You cannot run. You cannot resist." The figure tilted its head, its featureless face inches from hers, the weight of its presence suffocating. Madison's body trembled, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find her voice. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "What did I do?" The figure stood motionless for a moment before raising one elongated arm, its skeletal finger pointing toward the car. The trunk creaked open of its own accord, the box glowing faintly within. Its carvings pulsed with an otherworldly light, the symbols shifting and writhing as if alive. "You opened the door," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the fog. "And now, you must close it." Madison's eyes darted to the box, her stomach twisting with dread. She didn't understand what the figure meant, but she knew one thing: the box wasn't just a portal. It was a trap, a prison for something far worse than the shadows that had tormented her. Summoning what little courage she had left, Madison stumbled to her feet. The whispers followed her as she approached the car, each step heavier than the last. The box seemed to hum with anticipation, its glow growing brighter as she reached for it. Her fingers hovered over the lid, trembling, as the figure's voice echoed in her mind. "Step through. Finish what you started." When Madison opened the box, the world around her dissolved. The fog, the road, the car, it all faded into a void of absolute darkness. She floated weightlessly, the air thick and oppressive, her breath catching in her throat. The box remained in her hands, its glow illuminating only her face and trembling fingers. She felt the presence of the figure behind her, its voice a low murmur in her ear. "Look." Before her, the darkness began to shift, shapes forming in the void like ink dispersing in water. A vast, otherworldly landscape unfolded, a place of jagged cliffs and endless chasms, where rivers of shadow flowed beneath a sky that pulsed with a sickly red light. Towers rose in the distance, their surfaces covered in the same intricate carvings as the box, their spires piercing the sky. The air was alive with whispers, countless voices weaving together in a symphony of despair. Madison clutched the box to her chest, her heart racing as she took a hesitant step forward. The ground beneath her was uneven, cold, and wet, as though it were alive. The figure followed, its form blending into the shadows, its presence a constant weight on her back. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The truth was already sinking in. This was where the box had come from. This was where it belonged. And now, so did she. The ground trembled, the air vibrating with a low hum that grew louder with each passing second. The whispers turned into screams, their sound piercing and relentless. Madison fell to her knees, clutching her head as the world around her seemed to collapse inward. The figure stood over her, its skeletal hand reaching out to touch the box. "Close the door," it said, its voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Or the door will close you." Madison's hands shook as she opened the box once more, its interior glowing with a blinding light that seemed to consume everything around it. The carvings on its surface pulsed faster, their patterns twisting and rearranging into a single, intricate design. The ground beneath her cracked, tendrils of shadow spiraling upward, pulling her closer to the box. She realized then what the figure had meant. Closing the door wasn't just a choice. It was a price she had to pay. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this. The figure knelt beside her, its elongated hand resting on her shoulder. You must, it said, its voice softer now, almost sympathetic. The door must close, or the world will open. Madison sobbed, her grip on the box tightening as the shadows around her grew thicker, their tendrils reaching for the light within the box. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She placed the box on the ground and pressed her hands against its sides. The glow intensified, the light burning through the shadows, forcing them to retreat. The figure stood, its form flickering as the box's power grew stronger. You have chosen, it said, its voice reverberating through the void. The door will close. The light consumed everything, the shadows, the whispers, even the figure. Madison felt herself being pulled into the box, her body dissolving into the light as the world around her crumbled. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She understood now. The box wasn't just a prison. It was a balance, a barrier between worlds. And by stepping through, she had restored it. When the light faded, the road was empty. The car sat abandoned, its trunk open, its headlights casting faint beams into the night. The box was gone, and so was Madison. The world had returned to its normal rhythm, the fog dissipating as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. But those who passed that stretch of highway in the years to come would speak of strange occurrences. Whispers in the wind, shadows that moved without reason, and a feeling of being watched. No one ever found Madison Lane. Her apartment remained untouched, her belongings gathering dust. But in the quiet moments of the night, if you stood still and listened closely, you could hear it. The faint, rhythmic tapping of a box that was never meant to be opened.